Hello. Today I'll be taking us on a deep sea dive as we explore how climate smart management affects subsurface carbon in Tennessee soils. So first off, why do we care about subsurface carbon? We all know surface carbon is the basis of soil fertility. It's extremely important for water infiltration and retention. It supports a healthy soil biology. But if we're thinking about storing carbon long-term to sequester it from the atmosphere, subsurface carbon becomes really important, mostly because it has a lot of surface area that can stabilize carbon, and it's also just a much more stable environment. And so we need to start asking the question, how to increase subsurface carbon? And that is, in this age of carbon markets, the million-dollar question. And especially, can management have an effect? And it really seems like the effectiveness of a particular practice depends on site-specific factors like texture or climate or mineralogy. It's also really difficult to document whether change is actually occurring. If you think about it, that carbon's not getting deposited directly to the subsurface, so the changes are really slow, and they're also very variable, thinking about like decaying roots or earthworm burrows or macro pore flow. Also, these other factors like texture and mineralogy are going to be really different, even in the same field. And so what you find often depends on how and where you sample. So in this project, we took a region-based approach. We chose different regions of Tennessee with different ag systems and contrasting soils. And then within each region, we chose an agriculturally important soil type or family. And then for those cropping systems, we identified some climate smart practices that are typical, and then identified fields within each soil type that represent a gradient of those climate smart management practices. So within each field, we wanted both to be representative of the management and to reduce those other sources of variability. So we took a soil map, and within each mapping unit, we identified 3 transects of about equal length. And then we took 8 cores per transect down to 2 feet. We divided those cores into 5 different depths, and then we composited every 4 cores by depth. And that's what we did our carbon analysis on. And this was a huge project. So we worked with NRCS soil scientists across the state to identify those farmers and those fields that we worked with. So in Eastern Tennessee, we sampled at the East Tennessee Research and Extension Center in Blount County and also at Mossy Creek Farm in Jefferson County. These are on Dewey and Decatur soils. So these are clays, clay loams. They have a limestone and alluvium parent material and very variable, even within fields. And they all have a pretty good slope on them. At East Tennessee, we had a pasture management comparison. So our first site was a hay field with mixed with rotational, 2 cuts a year of hay, and they bring the animals on in fall for about a month to graze. It was tilled pretty recently, disked in 2015 and planted to corn. Next, we had an intensive and extensive rotational grazing systems. So these have both been under rotational grazing for about 10 years. And then before that, just continuous pasture, not tilled for more than 30 years. For our extensive system, it's never mowed for hay, and the animals are cycled through paddocks all year. So they're on each about 2 months a year, whereas in the intensive, you've got animals on there for about 5 months a year. They're there during winter, and it's occasionally cut for hay. And then finally, we have an agroforestry site with trees and hybrid poplars and native vegetation in the understory and in the alleys, no grazing, never cut for hay. The only management is it's mowed periodically. Next, we have a no-till chronosequence. So all of these sites are managed the same with a corn-soy rotation, a multi-species cover crop, but the owner acquired them at different times. So the youngest is an 8-year system that was previously under tomato, where it was very intensively tilled. Then we have one 25 years, and then 2 37-year under no-till and cover crop. And one of those had a history of biosolids application prior to when the farmer acquired it. So when we look at the carbon stocks, What you're looking at here is on the x-axis, that's the total carbon at each layer. And then on the y-axis here, that's the depth of soil going from the surface down to 2 feet. And here on the left, this is the pasture comparison. And I want you to take a look at this yellow line. That's the mixed system that with the hay and always had lower carbon stocks, really all the way down the soil profile and significant down to a foot. If you compare that to this blue line, that's the intensive rotational system, and always tended to have the highest carbon stocks and significant down to a foot. And especially in the topsoil, we didn't see a difference between the extensive and the intensive rotational grazing. The tree field ended up being a bit lower than we expected, especially in the topsoil, but it also was a much sandier soil. So we're taking those results with a grain of salt. Coming over to our no-till chronosequence, I want you to take a look first at this top 2 inches. So the green line here, that's the 37 year with the biosolids application. And then with the second highest carbon, we have the 2 long-term no-till, the 37 and the 25 year. And then finally, this yellow line, that's the youngest no-till site. But coming down to the 2 to 6 inch depth, we have a much different story. So that site with the biosolids history, that's still pretty high. But now the youngest site gets kind of a bulge of carbon in the subsoil. And that could be because when it had that intensive tillage, some of that carbon was on the top, got buried down in the bottom. And you can see it has higher stocks down to 1 foot. And then they kind of even out in the subsoil. And this 37 year no-till site always, even though it's not significant below a foot, always tends to have the lowest stocks. So when we look at the total carbon stocks in the top 2 feet, here at the pasture site, the intensive rotational has the highest, and it's not significantly different than the extensive rotational, but they're both higher than that mixed hay system, and the trees are intermediate. The no-till sites, interestingly, the only significant difference that we saw was between the 2 long-term sites, the one that got the biosolids and the one that didn't. That 8 year site that had a pretty high carbon in the subsoil, the losses in the topsoil were enough that they made the differences not significant with that long-term no-till. So moving over to Middle Tennessee, we have 2 row crop pasture comparisons, one in Warren and Cannon counties and one in DeKalb. And this is Dixon soil, so it's a much lighter soil, it's a less parent material, these fields are flat, more uniform, and they've also got a fragipan. So the first 2 are the row crop. They've both been under no-till since the 80s. They've had a cover crop, either wheat or multi-species, and they've had manure applications. The biggest difference between them is the first was heavily eroded. The farmer said it was a much worse field when he started managing it in this way. And we found that the fragipan was much shallower, it had a lot more coarse fragments. Another small difference is that the cover crop had been grazed, but just for the past 2 years, whereas the second site had deeper loess, fewer coarse fragments. And then we had a pasture soil. So this had been under pasture for 9 years. It was grazed in spring, fall, and winter. It was a pretty degraded pasture, not much ryegrass on there and mostly weeds. And we also found that it probably had a perched water table. It tended to be moister. We saw some redox features. Our second site had a similar comparison to long-term no-till with cover crops. These also had the cover crop was grazed, and this had been for more than 10 years. The only difference between these 2, the first was tile drained, the second wasn't. And then we had a rotational pasture. So the cows were cycled through paddocks all year. And so the cows were in a paddock for about 2 to 3 weeks a year. So what did we find? Want you to take a look at this green line on both of them. That's the pasture site. And it always had the highest carbon in the topsoil. for the first site, it tended to be a bit higher all the way down the soil profile, and that might have something to do with it just being a wetter site. Also notice in that first site, there wasn't any difference between the highly eroded field and the much less eroded field. And this goes along with what the farmer was saying, actually, that in the past 5 years, he's noticed that there hasn't been as much difference in crop performance between them anymore. Coming over to the second site where we had the cover crop, which was grazed for a longer term, this was interesting because we saw some significant differences in the topsoil and also between the drained and the undrained field, which also suggests that moisture was important at this site. But coming down to the subsoil, we didn't really see any differences between the row crops that had that grazed cover crop and the pasture. Looking at the total carbon stocks, at the first site, the pasture was significantly higher than the 2 row crop sites. But again, that eroded and non-eroded site, no difference from each other. At the other sites, no difference actually when we looked at the total carbon stocks between the pasture and the 2 row crop sites. So overall, what did we find in our deep sea dive? We found strong evidence that climate smart ag practices, and it seems like especially perennials and grazing, built soil carbon in the topsoil, and that showed up in the stocks down to 2 feet generally. We saw some potential trade-offs in topsoil and subsoil carbon under long-term no-till, but it didn't have a significant effect on total stocks, and some evidence that it could be offset by grazing or manure additions. We didn't see much evidence statistically that soil carbon was affected by management below the top foot of soil, but we did see some indications. I pointed out a few times those fields that tended to be high in the topsoil and all the way down the profile. And the lack of significance may be due to variability and other contributing factors. And as we go on with this project, we'll be measuring some of those and trying to disentangle those effects. You may be asking, what about Western Tennessee? Well, we'll be taking samples this fall after harvest, and if you have any fields that you think would be good candidates, we'd love to give you some free soil carbon testing. We'd like to focus on tillage, cover crops, and rotational or cover crop diversity, and we'd really like a range of each practice. So we would like to include some sites that have monocrops or frequent tillage or no cover crops. And our target soils, we'd like to be on Memphis and Feliciana. So if you have anything you might think might be a good candidate, I have my contact info at the end of this presentation. With that, I'd like to give a special thanks to our farm collaborators. They were really great to work with. And here's my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'd love to sample your fields. Thank you very much.